All right, I think we can get started. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. I hope you all have been enjoying the summit so far. My name is Maya Tobias, and I'm the Manager of Partnerships and Strategic Marketing at Course Hero. I'm very excited to welcome you to this session. It's called Ungrading and Self-Assessment, Practical Ways to Empower Students. It's going to be led by Dr. Jen Newton, who is an Associate Professor in Education at Ohio University. We really hope this session is going to inspire people to share ideas with one another. So throughout the session, we welcome questions, comments, and feedback. I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box. You can also add comments and discussion in the chat box. So Dr. Newton will answer some questions if they're timely during the session, but we'll also leave 5 to 7 minutes at the end to address questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Newton.
Hey, everybody. Let me get my screen up so we can share. All right. You see what I see? Yeah. Can't see any of you. So make sure you tell me.
Yeah, we see it.
If you're not seeing things. Okay, great. Hi, Wendy. All right. I'm excited to be here with you talking about ungrading and self-assessment, practical ways to empower students in their learning processes. I'm Jen Newton. I'm at Ohio University. I'm an associate professor in special education, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the ways in which I do ungrading and self-assessment in my teacher preparation coursework. I work primarily with students in their undergrad and graduate licensure programming. And so these are courses that students need to understand the content. It's required for their assessments, for their licensure. So oftentimes people say, oh, it's easy to ungrade in a general education class, but in my professional preparation course, I can't do those kinds of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do it with the expectations that students will gain the content knowledge and the expertise that I need for them to get while we're there in my class. So we want to start off by making sure you know how to access this session. To turn on auto captioning, we're using the AI captioning through Zoom. So click show captions at the bottom and you'll have captioning on your screen, and you can turn it on and off as you prefer. If you have any questions or problems with that, make sure you message the host and we'll try to help you troubleshoot that. You guys are from all kinds of places all over. I'm excited to meet and hear from you and get to know you. I see lots of people in the chat with lots of diverse experiences. So like I said, I'm Jen Newton. I have a PhD from the University of Kansas. So rock chalk to all those Kansas people who are on the call. I am currently an associate professor of special education at Ohio University, like I said. Prior to that, I was at St. Louis University. And prior to that, I was at James Madison University in Virginia. I've had super amazing experiences with tons of cool students and been working on refining my process around how I do grading all of these years. So, and if you're on Instagram or the beleaguered Facebook app, you can find me at Teaching is Intellectual. I am on Instagram at Teaching is Intellectual, and then I also have a Facebook page. So if you want to continue the conversation, I'd be more than happy to chat with you there. Kate, we love Coach Williams too. We are of the very rare variety of folks who are referred to as Tar Hawks, right? So we're Tar Heels and Jayhawks because we have some very deep running Kansas love for Coach Williams. I'm so sorry, Diane, about that house divided. I don't know about the K-State fan in your life. In our time together today, we're going to start off by establishing definitions and some shared understandings of the terms that we're going to use while we're talking today. We're going to talk about my approach to student self-assessment, why I think it's important, how I get my students there, and then what my students say about it. I've given you some of the feedback from some student course feedback, so we can talk about that as we move through, and then we'll have time for some questions and wrap up. I've been talking about ungrading for a really long time, and I was doing this sort of alternative assessment is how I referred to it back then, prior to my even knowing that there was terminology called ungrading. So depending on where you are in your ungrading process, This is kind of how I frame it. And I'd be interested to hear from you as to where you are in your process. Are you brand new to thinking about assessment or thinking about how you can assess differently? Or are you pretty far along in this process and trying to refine your procedures? Dr. Wallace says she's new to ungrading. So we can, this is going to be an overview of where I am about 12-ish years into trying new things related to alternative grading. So this is the definition that I use for ungrading. This is what I put in my syllabus. This is how I introduce it to students. This course will focus on qualitative, not quantitative assessment. You will get a final grade at the end of the term, but I will not be grading individual assignments in the traditional sense, but rather asking you questions and making comments that engage your work. You will also be reflecting carefully on your own work and the work of your peers. The intention here is to help you focus on working in a more organic way, as opposed to working as you think I expect you to work. Your engagement with your learning is my priority, and if at any time that feels unsettling to you, let's talk. You should consider this course a busy work-free zone. If an assignment does not feel productive, you can find ways to modify, remix, or repurpose the instructions. This comes from Jesse Stommel. His website, jessestommel.com, has lots of information about ungrading, and this helped me to articulate my assessment process in a way that I hadn't really been able to talk to students about it before. On my own. And so I use his words and I use that to sort of position the work of how we're going to think about assessment in my class. So on the very first day of class, I have a whole slide that says, these are some things that are challenging about taking a class for me. There are things that are really like easy about taking a class with me. Most of the work we do in class. The only thing they really do outside of class is reading, but there are things that are challenging. Like you can't check your grade book and go, okay, if I do the math, do I need to go to class on Tuesday or can I just skip? Right. But what I really like about this definition is where it says it's that you are working in an intentional and organic way rather than the way you think I want you to work. One of the things that started me on this journey was students saying, is this what you wanted? And I kept thinking, I don't want any of it, right? Like, I know this stuff. It doesn't help me to get that work from you. I want it to help you. I'm assigning you work so that it helps you learn it. It helps you understand it. It helps you think about it instead of framing it as, is this what you, Jen, want from me? Right? Because there's no learning in that. If you're just working toward what you think I want, you're learning about me, but you're not learning the content in an authentic way that gives you possession over it so that you own it. And then the second part of it is self-assessment. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Self-assessment is a really critical component of the work that we have to do in ungrading. And it is brand new to most students in college. And that's why I'm hoping that if some of you are in the K-12 realm, I'm hoping you're thinking about how do I encourage kids to learn how to self-assess? Because what I have when I get college students is this deep insecurity around how someone else will assess their work and no ability whatsoever to meaningfully reflect on their own work. So self-assessment is working together to determine a final grade for the course. They self-assess their own learning and they tell me what they think they learned and what they think they earned and why. Okay, so I provide them with prompts to reflect on their experiences with the readings, the in-class activities, and any submitted work we did throughout this semester with particular attention to the course objectives. So I try to always make sure this is where Jesse and I are different because my course has very firm course objectives that are required by the state, required by my licensing bodies, my accrediting bodies. I can't mess with those things. So I always want to come back to the course objectives and make sure that we are meeting them and that students feel confident in those. So I ask them to reflect about their own assessment in relation to their course objectives. Then they assign themselves a final grade. And then they provide with me with some explanation for how they came to that final grade. So, and I see
sorry,
questions.
Jen, yeah. Do you want to just
yeah,
this is relevant. So this is from someone named Lisa. She said We are judged throughout our life. Again, how is this giving them the skills to be able to deal with that as they grow?
So I think that that's a really interesting question. I would love to dig in a little bit more into what you mean by how we're judged throughout our life. As a tenured professor, when I went through tenure processes or workplace evaluations, it was always based on a specific kind of assessment based on a rubric given to me that I was then in charge of meeting. Most people in my field in education will tell you those aren't meaningful rubrics, right? They're not meaningful experiences. What I want is for my students to be able to talk about what they learn and what they know. And I think that prepares them very well for the future rather than arbitrary external evaluation that they may or may not even understand how it came to be.
This question might be jumping ahead a little bit. You might address it later, but do you always accept their self-assessed grade?
I don't, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we get there. Are we good
I'll
there?
do one
Okay.
more that also
Okay.
might be more appropriate for later, and we can hold off on it if you want. So, Mike, you can put that question also in the chat, and we can try to address it again later. This one's from Mitch. What does a typical grade distribution look like for one of your classes?
That's a great question. And again, it requires us to rethink the way we think about grades. So to me, a grade means mastery of content. It does not mean compliance for rules. It doesn't mean attendance. It means mastery of content only. And so my only objective for my students is that they will always demonstrate mastery of the content as connected to the course objectives. So that's an individual process. I actually don't do a grade distribution. And it depends on the students and how the semester goes. We are still, and as many of you are in higher ed, you probably can relate. We're still dealing with the effects of a global pandemic. We still have a lot of issues with attendance, with, motivation, commitment, mental health stuff, all of that. So I really work with students one-on-one, and this kind of gets us back to Mike's question. So I want to think a little bit, we'll come back to that as we're moving, because again, I'm engaging much more in self-assessment and collaborative assessment than I am like ungrading. I mean, the students get a grade, it's a course, and there's no way around that system. So let me kind of tell you how I do it, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. What happens when there's disconnect, right? So I give my students essentially a Google form at the end of the semester and ask them to reflect on everything that we've done throughout the semester. And like I said, it always comes back to the course objectives. So here are some questions from my personal Google form that I use for ungrading. The course objectives are measured by evidence of learning through your weekly group activities, your case study, and your group work rubric. Did you submit all evidence of your learning this semester? One of the things that I ask of them, and I tell them in the very beginning, and I tell them at every class, is that they will submit all the work for the course. You will submit all the work for the course. That you have to. That's how you pass the class. You have to submit all of the work that we do. We do most of the work in class. We do a lot of work together in groups, but you're going to submit it all. And so this is where they say, yes, I submitted everything. And then, sorry, I messed up. As much of our learning happens in community, reflect on your attendance this semester. And then I asked them, I attended all class meetings and contributed to my group's work. I attended almost all, missed 1 or 2 class meeting times and contributed to my group's work when I was there, or I missed 3 or more class meetings. So I asked them to reflect on their commitment to their learning, right? Because attendance isn't about me, it's about them. Did you show up for yourself? Did you show up to get out of the class I do this online, Daniel. I do the same thing. I'm teaching right now online. I teach online the same way. There are some things that you have to do with your learning management system because learning management systems and online courses are built around the grade book, but that we can talk about that in the questions. Then I asked them to,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, Jen, one question related to that was, what about a fully online asynchronous class?
Yeah,
Which is
that's my, all my,
fun.
so my undergrad classes are face-to-face and my grad classes are all online asynchronous. I ungrade in all spaces. I do this the same for every course that I teach, but it takes a little bit of a different vibe online. Because learning management systems, my university currently uses Blackboard, we're moving to Canvas, but it's all online classes are built around the gradebook. Everything happens in the gradebook and then it comes out into the course. So that's an incredibly challenging setup for a self-assessed, meaningfully alternatively assessed course. But I've managed to get that done by using some of the tools in the gradebook. So it still happens in the gradebook, but I don't assign points. But I do that for, I do teach online like this as well. Then I asked them to say, like, look through your activities and all the evidence of learning for this course. Do you see evidence that you mastered the course objectives as identified in the syllabus? They say yes or no. That's just a yes or no question. And then I ask them, what do you now know that you did not know in January? This is for a spring course. What did you learn this semester? What work was challenging? What work didn't feel useful? Did you change your mind about anything this semester? Tell me about it. Because I teach, this is specific maybe to my content, but I teach a lot of disability rights, disability advocacy, disability supports, disability studies content. And a lot of us, well, all of us grew up in an ableist system, thinking about disabled people as separate and othered. I'm trying to undo that through this coursework. So I want them to reflect on how they've grown in their constructs of ableism. Did you ever talk about this content outside of class? That's a question I got, and I saw someone say earlier that about Susan Blum's book. This is one of the, and I'll recommend that later, but that is one of the questions I got from Susan's book is, do you ever talk about the content outside of class? And I really, really love that question. Did this course connect with your other courses? Yes or no? How engaged and mentally present were you in the course this semester? So then I asked them, I was there and ready to go mostly. I was sometimes engaged and sometimes texting or surfing or doing work for other classes. We were all buying Taylor Swift tickets one day when we were in class, and everyone was like, well, now I know what I have to put. I have to put down that I was a little like distracted sometimes, or I was pretty remote. Approximately how much of the reading did you do? Then you do all of that. And then you come up with suggest a grade for yourself with comments on how you came to that conclusion. So some of their responses. Let's pause. Do you have questions for me? You're muted.
Oh, still? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. I said there's a lot of good questions, so let's just go through a few of them. So how do you handle students who may not be truthful in their answers?
Okay, we'll get to that.
Do you have any concerns about students using ChatGPT to answer these questions?
I have zero concerns about that. Zero concerns about that. I know every single one of these students, and I know, I mean, I don't know how ChatGPT would answer these questions specifically unless they told ChatGPT more about what we're doing. But I don't have any concerns about that whatsoever.
Okay. One person wanted to know how long are the long answers supposed to be. I would assume this screen kind of answers that.
Yeah, I'll give you some examples, but they get
answer.
shorter. Yeah, they get shorter, and I can talk to you about that. So like, here's an example. I feel like overall I would give myself an A, but like a middle of the road A, if that makes sense. These are undergrad students, right? I for sure did what was expected of me when it came to doing the work for the class. My case study group and I worked really well together as a team. I did miss one class for a therapy consultation, and so my group had to pick up some slack for me, which was beyond my control, but I still feel a bit guilty about it. All that being said, I took so much away from this course, and I do truly feel that I have learned and absorbed the information that you wanted all of us to take out of this class. I talk about things we learned in the class outside of class, which is a relatively new thing because this is one of the few college classes that I feel really engaged with the content beyond just turning the assignments in. So I think an A seems right based on all of that rambling. So this is pretty, it's very conversational, right? This is a student who's like, they've never been asked to assess their learning. And so they are thinking about how, and some of them are more open with their process, right? Of thinking about how do I get to a grade? These are children who came through a No Child Left Behind system, and they are very grade focused. They're very grade focused, and they don't know what their grades mean. And so they are thinking about, okay, all that I took so much away, I feel like I learned things, so that feels like I get an A, right? Because I feel like I learned the things you wanted me to learn, so that should be an A. I think like an A seems right, is what she says, right? So this tells me that oftentimes students don't know how their grades are determined. And when I ask them to determine them, these are students who will be teachers 2 years from now, 3 years from now, they'll be teachers of children. They need to know how to think about assessment. This is also part of my pedagogy.
That's right.
Then,
Just to jump in there, because this was the
yeah.
question, what subject are you teaching? And maybe some people missed that a little in the beginning.
I work in special education, teacher education. So I teach early childhood teachers and special ed teachers how to be teachers. They're teacher candidates. I teach disability studies, intro to special education, adaptations and modifications for disabled kids in classrooms. So these are all kids who are in professional prep programs learning how to be educators. And they came through a system of education where they were assessed. They got scores for end of grade assessments. They got grades. They took, the SAT and ACT to get into college. Much of that's not as salient now. My university we don't require SAT and ACT scores. We don't have cut scores anymore. So this is important for their future as educators, but also just as future parents, future people in a community to understand what a grade means, right? I try to tell them all the time that grades are actually really made up. I get to decide what the criteria is, and I get to decide if you met it or not. And I want them to think about whether or not they understand what that letter grade means. So the next one says, with the end of this semester, I am unsure how to grade myself. I'm not sure how you are calculating the importance of actual attendance versus engagement. I did miss 3 classes. However, when I was in class, I was engaged, constantly raising my hand and asking questions and starting conversations. I also believe with my group when I was there, I am offering to assist in any way and oftentimes in facilitating conversation. This course content is important to me, and I'm strongly considering getting my master's in something related. I feel like I have learned a lot and will take a lot of this information and work we completed with me. With that being said, I would grade myself either an A- or a B- based on the importance of attendance. So do you see her process of thinking about attendance means something, right? It matters if you're there or you're not there because the work of the class happens in class. But we also have a lot of knowledge now about whether or not being in class is best, related to, if you're sick, if you need to be somewhere else. There's lots of complexities around that. Philomena says, would it be important to you that the first student include specific examples and support evidence of their learning, as in learned a lot? Yes. And that is in part of the assessment earlier, where it says, what did you learn? How did your learning relate to the course objectives? What did you learn for each course objective? So I list a course objective and they have to put what they know about that, how they learned about that, what taught them about that. It also helps me to think about what I'm going to keep for next year, right? What am I going to keep the next time I teach this? What needs to be refined? What needs to be changed? What didn't land for them? I see a lot of people are really interested in what do you do if someone is failing? I have to be honest and tell you that by and large in my programs, I mean, students are accepted into their professional preparation program. They're not tending typically to not be present and not be trying. However, there are always issues with attendance, and if you're not in class, then you're not getting the work done in class. What I do related to everybody there's a lot of questions about this. So let me give you these responses and then we'll talk about how I handle it when there's a disconnect. So this student said, so you can see where they start getting smaller and smaller, right? With their responses, less thoughtful, less explanation. B+, I came in a few minutes late, a good amount of days, and missed one class. I feel confident that I learned what I needed to learn and have an understanding of the material, but the tardiness brings me down. Again, this is like a byproduct of public schools. If tardiness and attendance is the most salient feature for students. Every semester I go through I code all of the feedback. And the most important thing for a grade to my students, by and large, is their attendance. I feel very strongly that attendance is not the key factor in a grade. That tells me nothing about what you learned. It tells me something about your commitment. It tells me something about what was going on with you, but that doesn't tell me anything about what you learned. It's much more about compliance with the rules than it is about their learning. So I try to push them to think again about learning. Did that tardiness impact your learning? What did you learn specifically? Let's look at the course objectives. In what ways did you show what you know about these things? The next one is interesting to me because it has a percentage. This is, again, the way that students think about grades. This attendance or this percentage is completely made up. She said 93% participated in class, showed up on time, and attended every class. However, any work that was assigned outside of class readings, I had a hard time getting into. Okay, so I came to class, I did everything. I didn't do the reading, so I docked myself 7 percentage points. So now I have a 93%. I don't know how she came to that, but this tells us something about the ways in which students have been indoctrinated or conditioned to think about grades. That is something I think we could think about, is like that the not reading is important. It matters. It definitely matters for her going forward. But where did she decide that it was like a A- and not, a C? I don't know. So this is all kind of important for us to think about how to get there. And then this person gave themselves a B. I missed a few classes and didn't speak out much in class. I also am turning in this pretty late, meaning their feedback form. They were turning their feedback form in late. And so they were giving themselves a lower grade for that. How much do I care about timeliness? These are all things that we factor into grades, and they dilute the grade because grades should be only reflective of your learning, not about how well you complied with class rules, not how well you got to class, but we all do it to a certain degree and we've all accepted it, but there isn't evidence of learning in your tardiness. I don't know what that impact that has until we break it down a little bit more deeply. So those are all kind of things that that I think about. So I know there's a lot of questions. I'm going to pop in to the Q&A. And Maya, will you grab the chat when we're done, just so that I can follow up with people if there are things in here? Because there's so much good stuff. And
yes, there's so many good questions. I encourage people, if their question got kind of lost in the chat, please add it into the Q&A box. And I also encourage people to upvote questions in the Q&A box.
So Mitch says, have you scaled this up to a 200 plus student class? So the biggest class I've ever used this with is about 90 students. And the challenge there is that I typically will have a facilitator, someone who just does grading. That's their whole job, right? And so it's challenging in the sense that I have to teach other people and unlearn for my facilitators what my expectations are. And that makes it really hard to do, but it's not hard for the students. I think that my process of self-assessment is actually probably more time consuming because I do give a lot of feedback to students along the way. I sit with their groups, I write feedback in everything they submit. Those are all things that take more time than just assigning a grade. But in a 200, like when I had 90 students, I put them in groups. They do group assessments, they do peer assessments, and then I read a fraction of those. So it's not all of those things all the time. Again, it's probably simpler, but the learning is more meaningful in my opinion. What is your class size? My class sizes vary. Anywhere from up to about 55, 60 students in my async online classes. I usually have about 30 in person. I use the answers I code them all at the end of the semester. I figure out what are kind of salient themes. I think about what worked in the class, what didn't work, what we need to do differently. A good example of that is that in summer 2, starting next week, the class I'm teaching was an asynchronous online class that had a group project, and it came up a lot that was a stressor for students in last year's feedback form. And so I'm doing away with that group project this semester and then refining the direction so that they're going to do presentations to other members of the class, but not work together in a group. So that's how I'm going to like modify based on their feedback. Do they have access to these questions prior? So we go over it at the beginning of the semester. We do a baby version of it at the midterm, and then they do this final one. So they have a sense of what I'm going to ask and kind of what I'm looking for. And somebody said this really early on in the chat, but for some students, it's so unsettling, right? I don't have fixed due dates. Everything is pretty flexible, but I will make a calendar for students who need it. So if you say to me, Jen, this does not work for me, I need firm deadlines and I want to write them in ink in my planner, I do that. I make sure that they have a set due dates along the way because lots of students need that check-in. And that is fine with me. That doesn't bother me. Ashley says, when you began teaching, did you assign grades in a traditional way? And if so, have your assignments changed as a result? Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry. As a result of focusing on self-assessment over traditional grading. Yes, I sort of started out with people handing me syllabi, and I was on the tenure track. So I was very anxious about following rules. I didn't want to get in trouble. And so I slowly started, as I was assessing and talking with students and reflecting on our learning together, I slowly started like collapsing assignments, having fewer assignments, and being more clear. The ChatGPT question isn't never something that impacts me because I don't have students writing research papers. I have them really thinking specifically about context that they're in, teaching and learning that's happening within the context of our students. So I have changed my assignments quite a bit, and I don't have as much graded assignments as I used to. The average number of course objectives are less than 10. So usually between 8 and 10 course objectives. They do they discuss at all how they demonstrate what they learned? Yes, that's in their feedback form. I asked them to look at everything we submitted for the semester and then show me what they submitted that demonstrates what they learned per their course objective. I don't provide exemplars of answers showing students strong responses and average responses because I want students to authentically report on the ways in which they are feeling about their own learning, instead of having like a model to kind of meet up with.
Jen, will you just make sure you read the question first?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Know?
I'm so
that's
sorry.
Okay.
You're right.
Then also, we've got so many great questions. You can sort them by most upvotes. And then that way we'll make sure we get to the questions that people.
How about you read and is that okay?
Oh, totally. Happy to do that.
I see most upvotes now. Okay.
Oh no, it's totally great. Okay. How do you handle subconscious bias in ungrading a student? Positive bias, like having empathy, or negative bias, we are humans.
I think that's such an interesting question because I think that my own biases and my own feelings about a student matter less in this model than they did when I was traditionally grading. I feel here's the thing, and this is also a Jesse Stommel thing. I trust my students, and I see a lot of people. I see some comments that indicate maybe not everyone feels that way, but I trust my students. So let's talk about what I do when we disagree. I let me tell you a story. I have had a student who was watching baseball in class. He was in class, but he always had a baseball game on his laptop. He was very contrarian, right? He talked a lot in class, but it was always kind of the opposite of whatever anyone else was saying, which is cool and good. And that's how learning happens. They did an assignment, a class presentation they went first, and it was very, very, very minimal in comparison to what their peers did. And again, you're not comparing yourself to your peers, you're comparing yourself to yourself. And he self-assessed, gave himself an A. I disagreed based on a lot of the ways in which he showed evidence of what he learned, because I think the evidence he showed wasn't actually meeting the course objective, right? It was like taking away from the course objective. We have conferences. I conference with maybe 30% of the students in a class each semester. If we agree on your grade, or students grade themselves lower than I would, because students often factor in things like, I got sick. I had mono and I was sick for 2 weeks. And so I should get a B. If I don't think that their learning is reflective of that B, then I'll give them the grade up, right? But I don't meet with them. If I'm going to just boost their grade, I don't have a conference with them. If I disagree, I ask them in for a conference. When we have a conference, they present to me their data. They say, here are the course objectives you said I had to meet. Here are the ways in which I showed evidence of learning for those course objectives. It's almost always like a PowerPoint presentation that the student gives to me. And then I come with my data as well. And I say, okay, I see what you're saying. Here's where I'm thinking that you didn't meet these course objectives. Here's where your evidence is lacking. Here's where I needed to see more of this, or I would have liked to have had more of this. We then come to an agreement together. Again, I may be in a unique situation because my students are in a professional prep program. It doesn't really like come to blows with us. And I trust my students. So if they can make a case for how they made if they tell me these are the ways in which I did it, and then I give them the grade that they assign themselves, if they have made a case for themselves. Yes, absolutely. Always redo. I always have. So every single assignment is revise and resubmit. So every feedback opportunity I give you also provides an opportunity for you to provide a revision that's reflective of my feedback. That's always a rule. And that's part of my assessment process.
I've got another question from the chat, from the Q&A box. When you began teaching, did you assign grades in a traditional way? And if so, have your assignments changed as a result of focusing on self-assessment over traditional grading?
Yes, quite a bit. And I answered this a little bit earlier, but quite a bit, my assessments have changed and when I first started, I was doing weekly, reading check-ins. I was doing, there was lots of little points and everything was graded. And I've kind of moved away from that to doing more self-assessment, more reflective pieces, more of them telling me what they know. I remind them all the time that I know the content. I know it really well. And so I want them to know it. And I want them to be able to talk to me about it. And so that's kind of the way it's in which we set up our environment.
Thank you. All right.
But is it teaching them a life skill? If you make a bad decision, you can't redo. So this is so often an argument that is made, and it's just not true. Lisa, I'm sorry to call you out. It is not true. You can retake the bar exam. You can retake driver's ed and retake the driving test. There are tons and tons and tons of redos in life. Almost everything. Every mistake can be remade. Every course you fail can be retaken. There are very, very few things that are one and done. And my class is not going to be one of them. We are in it to learn. We are in it to be better, to open our minds, to advance our thinking. And grading, the research is pretty clear that grading limits learning. right? And so if I tell a student, oh, you got an A on that, then they're like, okay, well, I'm done learning about that. I'm ready to move on to the next thing. My own children tell me this all the time. They're like, I'm like, oh, here, let's figure out this. And they're like, we did area already. I don't know that anymore. I don't know how to find area anymore. I'm like, that's not learning. So the ways in which we promote learning is really important. And I want students to think about themselves as learning, not as doing and grading, getting a grade, but actually learning. We've moved away from really thinking about teaching and learning and really into assigning grades. All you hear teachers complain about is all the grading they have to do. Grading is not teaching. Grading is not learning. I want us to grow and learn and teach and learn. So that's what I'm in it for. Okay, I know we're like getting short. I see some people popping off too, but I wanted to give you my contact information. I talked so fast. Maya, how did we do? I was trying to get so much good stuff.
We have 4 minutes left. So
okay, I want to grab some of these questions, but I also want
I think we have time for one more from the Q&A that got upvoted. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Without a concrete rubric and grading scheme, what about grade appeals?
Oh, that's what a good question. Okay. That's such a good question. This has been one of the pieces that has really helped me refine my language. So that piece that I gave you from my syllabus, that is one of the introductory pieces. I also have a bit in the attendance about how a course like this is required. Your attendance is required because your participation is required. I take attendance data for my students, including everything that, when they email me and say they're sick or they've had a death or whatever in their family. So there are lots of ways that I collect enough data so that if there are grade appeals, we have the data to support it. And I haven't really had any issues with that. And my university has now moved towards sort of promoting this idea of thinking about the ways that we assess more broadly. And so I'm seeing more and more people doing this work, which is really helpful, I think. So my take home points would be, if you're brand new to this, if you're overwhelmed by everything I'm saying, I would say grade fewer things. Now, no matter what you're teaching, no matter who you're teaching, you could be teaching 7th grade algebra, grade fewer things. Have students reflect more on their learning, and you give them less letter and number grades. Let them think more about what they're learning and how they're doing. That's the number one piece of advice for anybody. It's just grade fewer things. And then the second piece of advice is ask your students to do self-assessment. Whether you grade it or not, ask them how they feel about the learning. Ask them how they felt about the work. Ask them how they felt about what they know and what they feel like they don't know. Ask them to think about it. Just start there, and you'll get lots of information from your students that will help you to form some strategies that will buy more engagement for you in the long run.
Just for one final question that kind of has come up a few different ways. So people would love access to some of your resources. Would you be willing to share a link to that Google form that you shared? And do you have a template of your rubric you might be able to share with people?
So I don't really use a rubric, but everything else, Michael, everything else I'm happy to share. I have, so you can follow me on Teaching is Intellectual. I have a bunch of stuff on my website, teachingisintellectual.com. You can email me. I have a Google folder full of research around grading and ungrading. I also popped up this book. If you haven't read this book, Ungrading, Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead, I definitely recommend reading that book because it's a really great place to start, and it will help you to think about some of the ways in which we've been conditioned to think about assessment. So if you're looking into all of this, I definitely think that's a good place to start, just to get you thinking. Yes, Jimmy says, I don't think ungrading is all or nothing. It is not. And I don't not grade. That's one of the biggest misnomers, right? My students get grades. They are constantly assessed. They just do a lot of their assessing on their own. And it's been really lovely for me. And I feel very much like they're learning more. And I'm telling them what to think less, which maybe feels good to me. So thank you so much. The name of the book is Ungrading, Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. And it's edited by Susan Bloom.
Thank you so much, Jen. We are all out of time, but this was a fantastic session with really incredible engagement. And we just really appreciate you joining us and sharing this. This session was recorded and it will be shared. We'll be sending it out to attendees next week. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there was a way for people to download the chat, but when you get the recording, you will be able to access the chat that way. And again, you can reach out to Jen at her email or her website if you want more information about any of this and check out this book. For those of you who can stay with us today, I would love to invite you to a meetup that is happening in about 10 minutes. It's about supporting BIPOC and first generation students. So that starts at 12:40 Pacific time. Feel free to go take a quick break and then rejoin us together there. I'm going to drop a link right now in the chat for you to click on. So thank you all so much. And thank you so much, Jen.
Thank you.